Someone in your group has not been right for weeks. It started gradually, a withdrawal from the social activity that normally anchors daily life in your community. They stopped joining the evening gatherings around the fire. They stopped participating in the hunt preparation conversations that they used to lead with enthusiasm and detailed knowledge. They sleep too much, or not at all. You're not sure which, because when you check on them in the early morning hours, they are often awake, staring at something that isn't there, somewhere far behind their eyes that you cannot reach. They have stopped eating with any regularity. They have lost weight that they cannot afford to lose given the caloric demands of the season. Sometimes they cry without apparent cause. Sometimes they sit completely still for hours with an expression that you can only describe as an absence. As if the person you know has temporarily left the body in front of you, and you are waiting with increasing anxiety for them to come back. You know this person. You have known them your entire life. You have hunted with them, traveled with them, shared food and fire and shelter with them across years of a life lived in close, constant proximity. What is happening to them is not a physical injury you can see and assess. It is not a fever you can measure by touch or a wound you can clean and dress. It is something happening inside, in the part of them that makes them who they are. And it is serious, and it is getting worse, and nobody in your group has a name for it. But here is the thing, your group has seen this before. Not exactly this, not this particular person in this particular configuration of suffering, but something like this. And the accumulated knowledge of your community, the knowledge that lives in the oldest and most experienced members, transmitted across generations in story and practice and careful observation, includes knowledge about this. Knowledge about what helps, what doesn't, what the person needs, and what the community's role is in providing it. Because ancient humans dealt with mental illness. They dealt with it consistently across hundreds of thousands of years, across every environment and every social configuration that ancient human life took. They had to, because mental illness is not a modern phenomenon, not a product of contemporary stress or social media or the alienating conditions of industrial life. It is as old as the human mind itself. And the mind that ancient humans carried was, in every neurological and genetic sense, the same mind we carry today. So how did they handle it? What did they know? What did they do? And what does the evidence, because there is evidence, more than most people realize, actually tell us about ancient approaches to mental suffering? This is one of the most human questions we can ask about our ancient ancestors. And the answers are more sophisticated, more compassionate, and more relevant to the present than you might expect. Let's start by establishing that mental illness in the ancient world was real, present, and not going anywhere. The neurological and genetic architecture underlying mental illness is ancient. The genes associated with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, anxiety disorders, and other conditions of serious mental illness are not recent mutations. They are old variants present in human populations across the full span of our species' existence. In some cases showing evidence of being maintained by selection, meaning that whatever functional costs they imposed on carriers in certain configurations, they also carried benefits in other configurations or contexts that prevented their elimination from the gene pool. The serotonin system, the dopamine system, the HPA axis governing stress response, the amygdala's threat detection functions. All of these neurological systems whose dysregulation underlies major categories of mental illness were present and operating in exactly the same way in ancient human brains as they operate in modern ones. The brain that can develop depression, anxiety, psychosis, or trauma responses in 2024 is biologically identical to the brain that ancient humans carried 50,000 years ago. The conditions that trigger these responses, loss, threat, isolation, physical illness, developmental stress, genetic predisposition, were all present in ancient life, in some cases more intensely than in modern life. Ancient humans grieved. They lost children. Infant mortality in ancient populations was devastating by modern standards. And they lost adults to injury, illness, predation, and accident. They experienced trauma. The psychological sequelae of surviving a predator attack, witnessing violent death, enduring extended periods of starvation, or living through the kind of catastrophic events that the ancient world periodically delivered. They experienced the specific stresses of a life lived in small, highly interdependent social groups where interpersonal conflict had immediate survival consequences, and where there was no possibility of the kind of social distance that modern life allows. Grief, trauma, depression, anxiety, psychosis. These were not exotic conditions that occasionally appeared in the ancient world. They were regular features of human psychological life, present in every community, expressing themselves with the same range and severity that they express in modern populations. The difference is not in the prevalence of mental illness between the ancient and modern world. The difference is in how it was understood and how it was responded to. Let's talk about understanding first, because how ancient humans conceptualized mental illness shaped every aspect of how they responded to it. Ancient humans did not have the biomedical framework that modern psychiatry uses to understand mental illness as a dysfunction of specific neurological systems. That framework is less than 2 centuries old in its current form. What ancient humans had was something different, and something that is worth examining carefully, because it was not simply wrong. In virtually every traditional culture that has been studied by anthropologists, mental illness is understood within a framework that integrates the individual, the social group, the natural world, and what we might broadly call the spiritual or cosmological realm. Disturbed behavior, emotional suffering, cognitive disorganization, these are understood not as purely individual biological events, but as disruptions of relationship. The person's relationship with their community, with the natural forces that govern life, with the dead, with whatever powers or entities the culture understands as operating in the world. This framework sounds, to modern ears trained in biomedical thinking, like superstition, but consider what it actually implies in practice. If mental illness is understood as a disruption of relationship, then the appropriate response is restoration of relationship. The sick person is not isolated, stigmatized, or treated as a problem to be managed away from the community. They are surrounded by community. The healing process involves the entire social group. Rituals of reconnection, ceremonies of reintegration, sustained collective attention to the suffering individual. The healer's role is not to treat the sick person in isolation, but to mobilize the community's collective resources, social, material, symbolic, and pharmacological, in service of that person's recovery. This is, it turns out, consistent with what modern mental health research identifies as the most important factors in recovery from serious mental illness: social support, community connection, a sense of meaning and purpose, reduction of isolation. Ancient healing frameworks built around the restoration of social and cosmological relationship delivered these things not as secondary benefits of treatment, but as the primary mechanism of treatment. They were working from the wrong theoretical model and arriving at some of the right practical conclusions, which is not nothing. Let's talk about the specific evidence we have for ancient responses to mental illness, because the archaeological and anthropological record is more informative than most people realize. The most direct evidence comes from trepanation, the drilling of holes through the skull, which we discussed in the context of physical medicine in a previous video. But trepanation has a specific relevance to mental illness that deserves its own examination. A significant proportion of trepanned skulls in the ancient archaeological record show no evidence of the skull fractures or traumatic injuries that might explain the procedure as a treatment for physical brain damage. In these cases, researchers have proposed that the trepanation was performed for behavioral or psychological reasons, to release whatever was believed to be causing the disturbed behavior. Whether that belief system involved spirits, malevolent forces, or some other conceptual framework for what was happening inside the disturbed person's head, the procedure was a real surgical intervention performed in response to behavioral or psychological disturbance. And here is the remarkable part. Some of these patients survived. The bone regrowth around the trepanation site that indicates survival is present in cases where the procedure was apparently performed for behavioral rather than physical reasons. People underwent brain surgery for psychological disturbance in the ancient world and came out the other side alive. Whatever else we can say about ancient psychiatric surgery, we cannot say it was uniformly fatal. The dental calculus evidence that has become so valuable in other aspects of ancient human research also offers hints relevant to mental illness. Several plant compounds with documented psychoactive properties, compounds from cannabis, from plants containing beta-carboline alkaloids, from plants in the nightshade family, appear in ancient dental calculus from contexts suggesting deliberate, repeated consumption rather than incidental ingestion. The use of psychoactive plants in the context of healing ceremonies, including the healing of mental disturbance, is documented across so many traditional cultures that its antiquity can be reasonably inferred. This is not equivalent to saying ancient humans were getting their mentally ill community members high and calling it medicine. The use of psychoactive plants in traditional healing contexts is typically highly structured, supervised, and embedded within a framework of meaning and social support that shapes the psychological experience of the substance. Modern research on the therapeutic use of psilocybin and MDMA for PTSD, depression, and anxiety is essentially rediscovering in controlled clinical settings the therapeutic potential of structured psychedelic experiences that traditional cultures have been using for treatment purposes for a very long time. Let's talk about the healer figure, the person in ancient communities who carried specialized knowledge and responsibility for mental health responses, because this role is both fascinating and frequently misunderstood. In virtually every traditional and ancient culture studied by anthropologists, there is a recognized role for a specialist in the management of illness that has psychological, spiritual, or behavioral dimensions. This figure goes by many names in different cultural contexts: shaman, medicine person, healer, spirit worker, and the specific practices associated with the role vary enormously across cultures and environments. But the structural features of the role are remarkably consistent. The healer is typically someone who has themselves undergone an experience of profound psychological crisis and emergence, what some researchers call the wounded healer pattern. They have been to the edge of psychological dissolution and come back, and the journey has given them both the practical knowledge of what that territory is like and the social credibility of having survived it. In many cultures, this origin story is understood as a calling. The healer did not choose their role. The role chose them through the experience of their own crisis. The healer maintains a specialized body of knowledge about plants, rituals, and interventions that are not generally available to the community at large. They are consulted when community members show signs of the kind of disturbance that falls within their domain. They perform ceremonies, often extended, elaborate, communally witnessed ceremonies that mobilize the community's collective attention and symbolic resources around the sick individual. The ceremony is important. It is not decoration around the real medicine. It is, in many cases, the real medicine. A ceremony that brings the entire community together to witness and affirm the sick person's value and belonging, that creates a framework of meaning around their suffering, that involves music and movement and social participation. That ceremony is delivering genuine therapeutic inputs: social reconnection, meaning-making, reduced isolation, oxytocin release from social bonding, the physiological effects of music on the nervous system, the psychological effects of being the object of collective care and attention. Modern psychiatric care, at its best, delivers the same inputs through different mechanisms: therapy, medication, social support programs, peer support groups, community mental health services. The delivery mechanism is different. The therapeutic targets are recognizably similar. Let's talk about community care specifically, because this is the dimension of ancient mental health response that is most directly applicable to modern understanding and most clearly documented in the anthropological record. In small group, high interdependence social structures, like those of ancient human communities, the management of a member's mental illness was necessarily a collective responsibility. There was no institution to hand the problem to. There was no professional service that could take the person off the community's hands. The person was part of the community. Their suffering was the community's concern, and the community's response was the primary determinant of outcome. What did that community response look like? It looked like presence. In documented traditional communities dealing with mental illness among members, the response consistently involves increased social contact. Community members spending more time with the person, making more frequent contact, drawing the person into social activities even when the person is withdrawn. The specific content of the interaction is often less important than the sustained fact of it. Someone is here, you are not alone, you are still part of us. It looked like practical support. An ancient community member in a depressive episode who was not eating, not sleeping, not maintaining the activities of daily survival was, in a practical sense, at risk. Community members who ensured that person was fed, that they were warm, that their basic physical needs were met without requiring them to manage those needs themselves. That practical caregiving was as medically important as any specific treatment. It looked like storytelling. The transmission of stories about others who had experienced similar suffering and recovered, the cultural archive of precedents that demonstrated the survivability of the current crisis, was almost certainly a feature of ancient mental health support. Every ancient community had, embedded in its oral tradition, accounts of people who had passed through dark periods and come out the other side. Those stories were medicine. The knowledge that you are not the first, that this has happened before and ended, that the community has navigated this territory, and that there is a path through it, that knowledge is therapeutically active in precisely the way that narrative therapy and peer support are therapeutically active in modern mental health contexts. Let's talk about something more specific. Trauma responses. Because ancient humans experienced acute traumatic events regularly, and their responses to the psychological aftermath are documented in ways that tell us something important. We know from skeletal evidence that ancient humans survived serious traumatic injuries. The healed fractures, the scarred bones, the evidence of recovery from conditions that should have been fatal. What we know from comparative anthropological research is that survival of serious physical trauma in traditional communities is typically embedded in a process of social reintegration that addresses the psychological dimensions of the experience as well as the physical ones. Rituals of return, ceremonies marking the reintegration of someone who has been through a dangerous or traumatic experience into the community, are documented across multiple traditional cultures. The person returning from a dangerous hunt that went wrong, the survivor of a predator attack, the individual who has been seriously ill and recovered. These people are not simply welcomed back into normal life, they are ceremonially reintegrated in ways that acknowledge what they have been through, affirm their belonging and value, and mark the transition from the exceptional state of crisis back into the ordinary state of community life. This ritual reintegration serves psychological functions that we now understand in neurological terms. The public acknowledgement of the traumatic experience validates the person's reality and reduces the social isolation that unacknowledged trauma creates. The ceremony creates a marker, a before and after, that helps the traumatized person integrate the experience as something that happened and ended, rather than something still ongoing. The communal nature of the ceremony mobilizes the social support that is the single most important predictor of resilience and recovery following traumatic events. Ancient humans were doing trauma-informed care before the term existed. Not because they had read the research, because they had accumulated across generations of living with trauma and observing what helped people recover, the practical knowledge that led them to the right responses. Now let's talk about what didn't work and what was harmful, because the honest account requires it. Not every ancient response to mental illness was therapeutic. In some cultural contexts, disturbed behavior was attributed to malevolent forces that needed to be expelled. And the methods of expulsion were sometimes physically harmful. Trepanation, which we've discussed as potentially therapeutic in some applications, was in other applications almost certainly harmful and sometimes fatal. The line between ritual intervention intended to help and ritual intervention that caused harm was not always clear, and the lack of a theoretical framework capable of distinguishing effective from ineffective treatments meant that both could persist in cultural practice simultaneously. In some contexts, individuals showing severe psychotic symptoms, particularly if those symptoms expressed as violence or extreme behavioral disturbance, may have been managed in ways that prioritized community safety over individual welfare. Physical restraint, exclusion from certain activities, restriction of movement, these responses to serious disturbance are documented in some traditional contexts and almost certainly existed in ancient communities as well. They were not uniformly compassionate, and they were not uniformly effective. The absence of any equivalent to modern psychopharmacology meant that conditions that respond well to medication, acute psychosis, severe bipolar disorder in manic phases, severe anxiety disorders, were managed with tools that could reduce suffering at the margins, but could not address the underlying neurological dysregulation in the way that modern medications can. People suffered more than they needed to. People who would have recovered quickly with appropriate medication sometimes did not recover, or recovered much more slowly, or became permanently disabled by conditions that are now highly treatable. The limitations of ancient mental health care were real and their human costs were significant. Acknowledging that is not a contradiction of the genuine sophistication that ancient communities also brought to the problem. It is simply the complete picture. Let me come back to where we started. Someone in your group has not been right for weeks. Here is what happens next in the ancient world we've been building together through this video. The healer is consulted. Not in a clinical appointment format. In the ongoing, embedded, socially integrated way that consultation happens in a small community where everyone knows everyone. The healer observes the person, speaks with them if they are willing to speak, speaks with the people closest to them about what they have noticed and when it started. The healer draws on a body of knowledge, accumulated over their own lifetime of practice and inherited from the practitioners who trained them, to understand what category of suffering this is and what the community's response should be. A ceremony is planned. Not immediately. Preparation matters, and the ceremony needs to be ready before it happens. The community is involved. Everyone has a role. The ceremony, when it comes, is an event. Music, movement, collective attention focused on the suffering person. The mobilization of every symbol and story and shared meaning that the community has for the navigation of this kind of darkness. The person is told through every channel the community has available that they are seen, they are valued, they belong here, and they are not navigating this alone. In the days and weeks that follow, practical care continues. Food is brought, company is maintained. The healer provides plant preparations, some sedating, some stimulating, some targeting the physical symptoms that accompany the psychological ones, with the empirical knowledge of what has helped in similar situations before. The person is drawn gradually back into the activities of community life, at the pace they can manage without pressure but with persistent invitation. Some people recover fully, some recover partially, some do not recover in ways that restore them to their previous functioning. The ancient world did not have a solution to every case of serious mental illness any more than the modern world does. But the ancient world had something that the modern world, in its fragmented, individualized, institution-dependent approach to mental health care, sometimes struggles to provide. A community that understood instinctively and practically that mental illness is not a private problem to be managed in isolation. It is a human condition to be held collectively, with sustained presence, practical care, and the deep reservoir of meaning that a community of people who know and need each other carries always. That is ancient mental health care. Imperfect, limited, working from the wrong theoretical framework toward some of the right practical conclusions. More compassionate in its fundamental structure than we usually give it credit for, and more relevant to the present than we might be comfortable acknowledging.